Okay, and now it's time to talk about one of the true geniuses of literature, American or otherwise, romantic, whatever, Emily Dickinson. She's one of the most fascinating figures in literary history precisely for the reason that we know very little about her. She's the sort of undisputed mother of American poetry, and she sort of has this image as this ghostly kind of figure because she was not somebody who was a public figure. She wasn't somebody who was, like Coleridge or Byron or Shelley or Wordsworth or any of these other individuals who were like out there in the world trying to promote themselves. Dickinson was in many ways kind of a shut-in, although that is sometimes overstated. She did travel a lot when she was younger, but it is true that as she got older, later in life, she pretty much just stayed in her room all the time. Didn't take many visitors. She was very sort of isolated from the public life. Despite this, though, she did write a lot of letters. She had a lot of personal correspondence. But really, the fact that only during her lifetime, only 11 of her poems were actually published, and it wasn't until after she died that her family went into a room and discovered this treasure trove of more than 1,800 poems that she'd written. Many of them were bundled up in little pieces of paper and tied off with string. And everybody was sort of like, oh, wow, there's a lot there. After her death, when they were found, actually a lot of them, she had requested that her correspondence be burned after dying, but luckily for us, this isn't something that people took her up on. They burnt some of her letters, but the poems were allowed to exist. People didn't quite know what to do with them at first, though, and a lot of them were subject to ridiculous editing, where they took away a lot of the eccentricities of her work. All the dashes that she has, the seemingly random capitalization, this sort of non-standard structure that she put her work in. These were things that people messed around with and tried to standardize, but eventually now in our era, they've been restored sort of to the original vision. The one thing in the versions that we're going to be talking about that is not in line with her initial ideas, that her poems they did not have titles on them, but now it's standard that we number the poems and also that we title them based off of the first line of the work itself. But really, one thing that's important to sort of know about Dickinson is just that we don't have any of her own analysis of her poems, really. We're just sort of forced to go to them and try to figure them out on our own, which, we stumble about. We, try to do our best because they are notoriously difficult. But if you're willing to put in the time, Dickinson is, truly fantastic and is an unparalleled genius. So, the first poem of hers we're going to be talking about is number 280. It is referred to by its first line, I felt a funeral in my brain. This is one of her more famous works, and some people sort of view this one as being a comment on the death of her sanity. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. Many people have sort of looked at this as, almost like a Dickinsonian cry for help, that it's like this is her, commenting on the death of her sanity, the funeral in her brain as she sort of, lost her mind in a sense. But I personally find that to be a little bit patronizing of an interpretation. I prefer the idea that, in a sense, like this is a comment on enlightenment. Sort of at the end here, it says, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. That there's sort of this idea, perhaps, that losing reason, that escaping from reason and rationality, that in a sense, that's sort of the gateway to a new knowing. One other fascinating thing about this is the editorial decision at the end. There is this situation at the end where it says, and hit a world at every plunge and finish knowing then. That ending sort of has this notion that, knowing is over, that we're in the state of uncertainty. But then in one of the manuscripts of this poem, Dickinson had actually added a final line, crash got through, which sort of, is definitely a more positive way of viewing the end, that once this plank and reason breaks, that you have no knowing, but then crash get through, that you're on the other side now, that, either in death you achieve some sort of awakening, or that once you sort of escaped from sanity and reason, that now, you are through to the other side. But in most of the respected or, canonized versions, that line has been removed, thus leaving us with the "and finish knowing then" conclusion. But regardless, it's an interesting thing to think about, and it's definitely, shows just a little bit that sort of idea of the great debates that can happen when working with her poetry. Next up is number 341. After great pain a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore in yesterday or centuries before? In some ways, this poem is about dealing with loss, right? Like after great pain. Okay, so something bad has happened. There's there's been suffering that's been endured. Maybe somebody has died or something bad has happened. But one thing that's sort of interesting about it is this idea of a formal feeling comes. So you have this great pain, but then eventually you're just sort of numb to it. It just sort of like goes away. Time just keeps moving forward. The feet mechanical go round of ground or air or ought. That idea of ought is really interesting because that implies the notion of what is to be rather than what is. But that, when you suffer a great loss, you just sort of slowly but surely you drag your way through it, a wooden way, regardless, grown a quartz contentment like a stone. So this idea of, this time just sort of passes. This is the hour of lead. But then ultimately, this pain is something that will sort of heal you in a sense, that you will let go of it, that you will be liberated by it, that almost in a sense the idea that suffering is a cleansing situation. And this poem ends with a really, really fantastic image. It's sort of a dark image, as we will see many sort of dark things in examining Dickinson's poetry, but this sort of idea here: remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. So this idea of, somebody freezing to death. First they're cold and they're like stupor, they're shaken, they don't know what to do, but then eventually they just sort of acquiesce to what's happening. They allow themselves to freeze. So that's definitely sort of a morbid way of thinking about it, but in a sense, once they have sort of given in to the inevitable, and once they've given in to what's happened, then they are sort of free from pain. So that's sort of an idea of dealing with the healing process. So the next work, 435, Much Madness is Divinest Sense. This is a fantastic little work. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, which means object, especially on moral grounds. You're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. This poem is kind of hilarious, and it's about like the tyranny of democracy, right? This idea that much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. So basically the idea that, mass culture, mass agreement, the things that we all agree on, that seems most sensible may in fact be madness. And the thing that seems like madness, the thing that seems like insanity, that might actually be the real sensible idea. And if you look back through history, so many people who, had ideas that seemed insane by the common majority or whatever, they've ultimately been vindicated in time. Okay, like look at somebody like Galileo, for example, vindicated in time. Somebody like Socrates, vindicated in time. Somebody like Jesus, okay, like during his time, they actually wanted him to be killed, but then in time we see him as sort of a great leader. So there are these examples throughout time in which something that seemed like madness ultimately was divinest sense. And that's what she's talking about in this poem. You can actually even sort of regard it in terms of her own life and what she did in her own sort of experience, because to other people, she, like staying in her room all the time, for example, may have seemed insane. And to us today, that seems maybe crazy, but in another way, maybe there is a divinest sense to that. And also this idea of, the freedom of thought versus the freedom of the body. You can't have both, because if you have freedom of thought, maybe the body is going to be constricted because you're going to be succumb to social pressures. But if you have the freedom of the body, where you are allowed to do as you please, in accordance with social standards, you're going to have to sort of suppress your own mental will in what you want to accomplish in your life. So there's some complicated stuff there. Next up is 465. I heard a fly buzz when I died. This may be her most famous poem, and it's incredibly famous for a reason. The basic setup of this poem is really brilliant. There's this person who's on their deathbed. They're about to die. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. Such a beautiful image, right? The idea of like the storm coming in and, but there's the stillness in between the heaves. Everybody has, cried their eyes out. The eyes around it wrung them dry and breaths were gathering firm. Everybody's just like waiting with bated breath for that last moment. All the keepsakes had been willed away. Everything had been like given away and all that. And everybody's just waiting for death. And they're at that exact moment, the exact moment where death is going to happen. There's a fly, and a fly buzzes. And it says, there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, the windows being the eyes or the sense or the mind, and then I could not see to see. So one thing I think is great about Dickinson is how just ironic and hilarious she is. A lot of times people have this mistaken impression that she's like really dark, right? That it's like, oh, she only talks about death and it's all sad and it's all morbid. And yeah, she does talk about death a lot, and there is a way to view that as sort of a darkness. It's definitely something that she seems like obsessed with in a sense. But the way she talks about it, a lot of times there's a comedy to it, like an absurdity. That it's like, oh, here's this person on their deathbed, and then like, oh, there's a fly buzzing. That's kind of hilarious. And it forces us to consider, what does a fly mean, right? Like, what if it was a different animal? What does a fly represent? And also just this notion of, the fate of reality, the fate of that, the corpse sort of represented by the fly versus the fate of the soul, which maybe, has some sort of, greater future ahead of it. So there's lots of stuff in there, and just tons of other things to consider, like the idea of when the king be witnessed in the room, whether the king already there, is the king only there like at the moment of actual death, can that be seen by anyone, signed away, what portion of me be assignable, idea of, willing away your keepsakes, what can be kept and what must be given away, is there any point to having possessions in this life if ultimately they all must be left behind? This isn't like an Egyptian pharaoh thing where, you're buried with your possessions and you get to bring them with you. We sort of have to give them away. Then there are even other, like, more sort of minor things that you could really look into. Like, for example, here in the last stanza, the word light, right? Like, we see how Dickinson is very willing to capitalize words that she believes are important or that have, greater sort of meaning, right? But here at the end, light, she does not capitalize. Like, what is she trying to say by not capitalizing light there? Is she sort of diminishing the idea of heaven or diminishing the idea of salvation or enlightenment? Who knows, right? Because we can't ask her. So lots of interesting things going on there. Definitely a truly brilliant piece of work. Next up is number 501, This World Is Not Conclusion. I really love this one a lot. I think it's a fascinating work. This world is not conclusion. A species stands beyond, invisible as music, but positive as sound. It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy don't know, and through a riddle at the last sagacity must go. So it's sort of this idea of like, this world isn't the end, there's something beyond, but we as humans, we make all these attempts to try to understand it. We use things like science, we use things like, scholasticism, we try being wise or having sagacity or philosophy, but ultimately, we can't figure it out, right? But we were puzzled by it. It says, to guess it puzzles scholars, to gain it men have borne contempt of generations and crucifixion. Like we've died and like suffered and all these things to try to figure out what happens and try to, come up with answers. But man, we just struggle and struggle and struggle. And here again, we see her sense of irony, right? It says, plucks at a twig of evidence and asks a vane the way, right? So it's like the idea of you ask a weather vane the way, because a weather vane tells the direction the wind is blowing, right? But then she also loves puns. So there's the idea that it's like, oh, it's vanity, right? And asks a vane the way, that to even try to know the answer is vain, because it's hopeless, it's ridiculous. And it's very reminiscent, Dickinson knew the Bible very well. It's very reminiscent of in Ecclesiastes, where it's all talking about how all of life is vanity and all of the things that we do and try to figure things out and the possessions that we have and the answers that we come up with. It's just vanity, 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 right? And she makes this play on a weather vane here. And then ultimately, she says, much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll, narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. So that basically we go to church and we try to find answers. We have all these things, but even drugs, even narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul, that uncertainty, that lack of answer, that even if we take drugs to try to dull the desire for knowledge, that our answerlessness continues to plague us all the more, that there's nothing that we can do about it. Next up is number 668, Nature is What We See. This is actually, compared to many of her works, kind of straightforward and simple. It has a lot more just direct imagery, maybe a little bit less sort of sleight of hand, but it still has, of course, many, many layers of complexity. So it basically is just about this idea of, what you see in nature. It's all very straightforward. Nature is what we see. Of course, there's the joke that she puts nature in quotation marks. Why? Who knows? It's very comic, right? The idea of nature is what we see. There's almost like a sarcasm there. The hill, the afternoon, squirrel eclipse the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. Nature is what we hear. The bobolink, which is a type of songbird. The sea, thunder, the cricket. Nay, nature's harmony. So she's trying to come up with all these answers. What is nature? Nature's what we see. No, 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 no. Nature's heaven. No, no, no. Nature's what we hear. No, it's not that. It's harmony. No, no. Nature's what we know, yet have no art to say. So impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity. And this is the beauty. This is sort of the punch there at the end, where so impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity, that nature is this beautiful thing, but us human beings, we human beings, and all of our wisdom and all of our genius, we can't do anything. All of our wisdom has nothing on the simplicity of nature. It's sort of an argument that the mountain of human intellect is just, a total pathetic drop in the bucket compared to the glory of nature in all of its simplicity. Next up is number 712, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Yet another incredibly profound and famous work of hers. This is another one where if somebody's going to bring up Emily Dickinson, this might be the type of poem. Very, very famous lines. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. This sort of, and again, like the irony, the kindness of death. That death, it's like, oh, I was so busy, I couldn't stop for death. I didn't have time for death. But death kindly stops for you. Death will always make time. So it says, we slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. Like the idea that death is civilized and sophisticated, and we, in our labor and our leisure and our playing around, that we're the vulgar ones. Like death isn't the morbid, vulgar, grotesque thing. It's us, trying to, make money and live a happy life and all this. That's the absurdity. We passed the school where children strove at recess. I always love that she uses the word strove there. Of course it implies the idea. It's like, it's not where children played. It's that they strove, that they're struggling, that there's some sort of difficulty in this sort of finding your way through life. going on. It's this idea: we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of a ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. That's the idea of the grave, right? We paused just for a moment, right? That the idea of the grave, that's just a brief little stop on this way. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity, right? That the idea that it's like, that death is just it's this ongoing thing, that it is eternity, 'tis centuries and yet fell shorter than a day, that that being gone, that being in eternity, that being in this, afterlife, in a sense, that is a thing where time no longer really plays a role, that it's just this ongoing foreverness, and that we just sort of, get to experience it. There's a lot of intrigue to this one, the idea that, eternity is something forever, but it doesn't feel like forever. We're not necessarily, taking our time with it. And also just this idea that death is doing us a favor, that he's coming and picking us up so that we can go on this adventure. Next up is number 754, My Life Had Stood, a Loaded Gun. This poem is difficult. Okay, this, of all the ones that are out there that Dickinson has wrote, this is one that really is a challenge to try to work your way through. But if you're able to do it, man, there is a lot going on here. This idea: my life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day the owner passed, identified, and carried me away. So you immediately are forced onto multiple planes of understanding. Okay, like the idea that you are a loaded gun, okay, that you were just there waiting, okay, until one day your owner, the gun owner, comes and takes the gun and carries you away, okay. Then there's also the idea that you aren't just a loaded gun, that your life itself is the idea of this thing like a loaded gun, that it has all this potential, that it's full of all this possibility. But then the owner, here's the big thing, is that the owner could be God, right? That's a possibility, and that you've just been waiting there, and then God comes and takes you and allows you to sort of fulfill your duty. Also, there's the possibility of the idea of the owner as a love interest, right? Some people like that interpretation. I think it's a little bit dull, but there's definitely something to it, that basically, you are waiting there for the beloved, and once the beloved shows up, then and only then are you going to be sort of free and liberated to live your life. So as you go through the poem, that's those three different ways of looking at it are always going to be in there, and you can sort of interpret each and every line and each and every stanza based off of those three different interpretations. So you can see how in a hurry this poem becomes incredibly complicated. But one of the big sort of themes that runs through it is this idea of, that you can achieve power through submission to the control of the owner, right? Regardless of what that is, that if you submit to this greater power, regardless of whether it be God or, a beloved, or just the idea of a gun owner, that in all of these things, once that is present, that is what allows for the enablement of and fulfillment of a greater purpose. So as it says, and now we roam in sovereign woods, and now we hunt the doe, and every time I speak for him, every time the gun is fired, every time you as a human being talk or do something, the mountain straight reply, the echo, right? And do I smile such cordial light? The idea of you smiling as an individual, or the idea of gunfire, all of these things are there. And as the poem goes on, the complexity just piles on complexity. This is definitely a complicated work. And at the end, the last stanza just blows the roof off in terms of complication. Because here at the end, though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die. So that, you can think about it in terms of a gun and a human being. Okay, so the gun might live longer than the person who owns the gun, but he, in a sense, lives longer than the gun because he could potentially have an eternal soul, but whereas the gun has the power to kill but not the power to die. right? So, man, complicated. If you start thinking about that in terms of the God interpretation, oh man, that's a really complicated thing, because though I than he may longer live, the idea that an individual person can live longer than God, that's complicated stuff. He longer must than I. Okay, that's sort of something more in accordance with what we would believe. But then there's the idea the individual is not capable of dying, whereas a God would be capable of dying. Whew, man, big ideas, big ideas. This poem right here, this is the reason why people devote their entire lives to studying Emily Dickinson. This is the reason why Emily Dickinson, a woman who mostly, avoided fame in her own life, is now universally viewed as an unparalleled genius. It's just that she's able to pack that many ideas into this little tiny poem. So that brings us to 1129. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And I think this is a sort of a fitting one to be sort of like later in the series, as it's all about the idea of telling the truth and what the truth is. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. So a couple big things here. It's all about the idea of truth, and if you have truth and have knowledge, how do you relay it to somebody else? She says, tell the truth. Don't be dishonest, but come at it from an angle. Tell it slant. Don't tell it straightforwardly. If you go up to somebody and you're just like, hey, I don't like you, that's going to be a very difficult thing for them to hear, right? But if you try to tell them that truth in some sort of more subtle way, you might have better luck sort of relaying that information without getting punched in the face. And that sort of works like that with any sort of truth, right? If somebody is going to be, dying, or something bad's going to happen, or you have some sort of great truth, this idea of, or truth in terms of like greater questions of reality, epistemology, metaphysics, reality, there's a lot of complicated stuff there, but maybe going in a roundabout fashion is a better way. Some people look at this poem very directly as Dickinson, sort of an ars poetica, like her commenting on the nature of her art itself. As it says, success in circuit lies, right? That if you go around the truth, that's the way that you're going to get to it, not by going straight to it. But of course, we get more of her sort of irony, because success in circuit lies, right? Oh, does she mean lies as in that's where it is, or lies as in there's an element of dishonesty there? So there is this idea, use perspectives, take your time with finding the truth. Is this poem just about poetry, or about everything? I think it's probably about everything, but it definitely stands for her poetry as well. And the end of the poem is truly great. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. The idea that you can't have it all, because quite literally we can't handle the truth, right? If you try to give it to us right at the beginning, we'll be blinded by it. We can't deal with seeing the whole fantabulousness of truth as it is in the world. We need to just get it one little tiny snippet at a time. And if we're able to get it that little tiny snippet at a time, then and only then are we going to be able to really, truly put it all together. So, with this in mind, this has been quite the lecture on Dickinson, but she is unquestionably a total genius. If you find her to be incredibly difficult in first encounter, I don't blame you. Okay, she is a complicated read. A lot of times her diction is, difficult. All the dashes are difficult. We don't necessarily know what to do with it. I confess that for years I found Dickinson to be relatively complicated and unapproachable. Now she remains incredibly complicated, but very approachable. You just have to be willing to sort of think about it, open yourself up, and most of all, just try to enjoy it, because she is unlike anyone else.